Her dark eyes scanned the road ahead, barely taking in the scenery. Her mind was elsewhere, caught in a whirlwind of emotion she couldn't quite untangle. After all these years, she was finally going to see her father again, David Wilson, the man who had been absent for most of her life, not by choice, but because of a terrible mistake. He's free now, Monica muttered to herself, her voice barely audible over the hum of the car engine. The words felt strange on her tongue, as if she was trying to convince herself of their truth. Relief washed over her in waves, but it was quickly followed by a surge of anger that made her jaw clench. All those years lost, all the milestones her father had missed, her high school graduation, her first heartbreak, her struggles to make ends meet. The injustice of it all made her blood boil. Monica's grip on the wheel tightened until her knuckles turned white. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm brewing inside her. It wasn't fair to blame her father, she knew that, but the hurt and resentment that had built up over the years weren't easy to let go of. As she drove past a small park, Monica caught sight of a father pushing his little girl on a swing. The sight made her heart ache. That could have been us, she thought, blinking back tears that threatened to fall. The car slowed as Monica approached the address she had scribbled on a crumpled piece of paper. It was a modest house with peeling paint and a small, unkempt garden. This was where her father was staying since his release. Monica parked the car and sat there for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, gathering her courage. But as she reached for the door handle, Monica hesitated. What would she say to him after all this time? How could she bridge the gap that years of separation had created between them? With a shaky sigh, Monica stepped out of the car. The weight of the moment pressed down on her shoulders as she walked up the cracked concrete path to the front door. Each step felt like a journey through time, bringing her closer to a reunion she had both longed for and dreaded. Monica stood frozen on the doorstep, her hand hovering inches from the doorbell. Her mind raced with memories, each one a painful reminder of the life she and her father had lost. She remembered the day the police came to their home. She was just a little girl, confused and scared as they took her daddy away. The image of her mother collapsing to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, was etched into her mind forever. After that, everything changed. Her mother, Sarah, had to work 2, sometimes 3 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads. Monica grew up fast, learning to cook, clean, and take care of herself while her mom was away. There were nights when she'd cry herself to sleep, wishing her father was there to tuck her in and tell her everything would be okay. As she got older, the visits to the prison became less frequent. It hurt too much to see her father behind that glass, his eyes filled with sadness and regret. Monica built walls around her heart, trying to protect herself from the pain. But the anger and resentment grew, festering like an open wound that refused to heal. Now, standing at the threshold of reuniting with her father, Monica felt a whirlwind of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Part of her wanted to run back to her car and drive away, to protect herself from more heartache. But another part, a small voice deep inside, longed to see her father's face again, to hear his voice without the crackle of a prison phone line. With a deep breath, Monica stepped back from the door. She needed more time. She wasn't ready for this confrontation yet. Her feet carried her back to her car, and soon she was driving again, no real destination in mind. As she rounded a corner, Monica's heart skipped a beat. Up ahead, she saw flashing lights and orange cones doing a police random checkpoint. Her palms began to sweat as she gripped the steering wheel tighter. Even though she knew she had done nothing wrong, years of distrust towards law enforcement made her stomach churn with unease. Monica slowed her car, joining the line of vehicles waiting to pass through the checkpoint. She watched as the officers spoke to each driver, their faces serious and focused. With each car that moved forward, Monica felt her anxiety growing. As Monica's car inched closer to the checkpoint, her heart pounded in her chest. She took deep breaths, trying to calm her nerves. Finally, it was her turn. A tall officer at his temples approached her window. His name tag read, Officer John Harrison. His face was stern but not unkind. As she rolled down her window, the officer said, "License and registration, please," on his voice firm but polite. Monica's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her purse. She fumbled with the zipper, her anxiety making her fingers clumsy. After what felt like an eternity, she managed to pull out her wallet and retrieve her license. She then leaned over to the glove compartment for her registration. "Here you go, officer," Monica said, handing over the documents. Officer Harrison took them with a nod. He glanced at her license, then back at Monica. Suddenly, his whole demeanor changed. His eyes widened slightly, and his body stiffened. The change was subtle, but Monica noticed it immediately. A cold feeling settled in the pit of her stomach. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Officer Harrison's eyes darted between the license and Monica's face several times. His brow furrowed, and he seemed to be struggling with something internally. Monica's palms began to sweat. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles turning white. The silence stretched on, becoming more uncomfortable with each passing second. Is everything okay, officer?" Monica finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Officer Harrison didn't respond immediately. He looked at Monica again, this time with an expression she couldn't quite read. Was it guilt? Surprise? Fear? Whatever it was, it made Monica's anxiety skyrocket. The air in the car felt thick and heavy. Monica found it hard to breathe. She wanted to ask more questions, to demand answers, but fear kept her silent. What could be causing this reaction? Did she do something wrong? Was there a problem with her license? As the tension mounted, Monica felt like she was balancing on a knife's edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Whatever was about to happen, she knew it would change everything. Officer Harrison stepped away from Monica's car, motioning for another officer to join him. The two men huddled together a short distance away, their voices low and urgent. Monica strained to hear what they were saying, but their words were lost in the hum of passing traffic. Her heart raced as she watched them, trying to read their body language. Officer Harrison's shoulders were tense, his hands moving in quick, sharp gestures as he spoke. The other officer nodded, his brow furrowed in concern. Monica's fingers tapped nervously on the steering wheel. What could they be talking about? Why did her name seem to cause such a stir? She thought about her father, about his wrongful conviction, and a cold fear gripped her heart. Could this have something to do with him? The minutes ticked by, feeling like hours to Monica. She glanced at her rearview mirror, noticing a line of cars forming behind her. The other drivers looked impatient, some craning their necks to see what was causing the holdup. Officer Harrison and his colleague continued their hushed conversation. At one point, the other officer shook his head firmly, seeming to disagree with something Harrison had said. Harrison ran a hand through his hair, looking frustrated and conflicted. Monica's mouth felt dry. She wished she could hear what they were saying, but at the same time, she was afraid of what she might learn. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the officers appeared to reach a decision. They both nodded, their faces grave. Monica's heart skipped a beat as she saw them turn and start walking back towards her car. She sat up straighter, trying to appear calm and collected, but inside, her emotions were in turmoil. What were they going to say? What had they decided? The uncertainty was killing her. As the officers approached, Monica took a deep breath, bracing herself for whatever was coming next. Officer Harrison approached Monica's car, his face a mask of forced composure. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," he said, his voice steady but strained. Monica's heart pounded in her chest. She hesitated for a moment, her mind racing with questions and fears. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the car door. As she stepped out onto the asphalt, the warm afternoon sun beat down on her. She could feel sweat beading on her forehead, though she wasn't sure if it was from the heat or her growing anxiety. "What's this about, officer?" Monica asked, trying to keep her voice level despite her rising panic. Officer Harrison avoided her gaze. "We just need to conduct a more thorough search of your vehicle, ma'am. It's standard procedure." Monica watched in disbelief as the other officer began to search her car. He opened the trunk, rifled through her bags, and even looked under the seats. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. As the search continued, Monica's mind whirled with possibilities. Was this because of her father? Had something happened that she didn't know about? The uncertainty was almost unbearable. Other drivers honked their horns impatiently, but the sound seemed distant to Monica. All she could focus on was the officers methodically going through her belongings. Officer Harrison stood nearby, his posture rigid and uncomfortable. He kept glancing at Monica, then quickly looking away, as if he couldn't bear to meet her eyes. The search seemed to go on forever. Monica's legs felt weak, and she leaned against her car for support. She wanted to demand answers, to know why this was happening, but fear kept her silent. As the other officer emerged from her car, Monica held her breath. What had they found? What would happen next? The tension of the moment stretched like a rubber band ready to snap. Officer Harrison took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. He turned to face Monica, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and regret. "Ms. Wilson," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you." Monica's heart raced as she watched the officer struggle with his words. She could sense that whatever he was about to say would change everything. I was the officer who arrested your father all those years ago," Harrison finally confessed, his words hanging heavy in the air between them. Monica felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Her mind reeled, trying to process this shocking revelation. She stared at Officer Harrison, her eyes wide with disbelief and growing anger. "You?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're the one who—" Memories flooded Monica's mind. The night her father was taken away, her mother's tears, the years of struggle and loneliness. All because of this man standing before her. A surge of rage washed over Monica, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her whole body shaking with emotion. "Do you have any idea what you did to us?" she demanded, her voice rising. "My father lost years of his life. Our family was torn apart." Officer Harrison flinched at her words, his face etched with remorse. "I'm so sorry," he said softly. "I made a terrible mistake, and I've regretted it every day since." But Monica wasn't ready to hear his apologies. The pain of the past was too raw, too fresh in her mind. "Sorry?" she spat. "Sorry doesn't give us back those years. Sorry doesn't fix what you broke." Tears welled up in Monica's eyes, a mixture of anger and long-suppressed grief. She felt betrayed not just by Officer Harrison, but by the entire system that had failed her family so spectacularly. As Monica stood there, trembling with emotion, Officer Harrison looked utterly defeated. The weight of his past actions seemed to physically press down on him, making him appear smaller and older than he had just moments before. Monica's anger erupted like a volcano, her words spilling out in a torrent of pain and accusation. "You ruined our lives," she shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. "Do you know what it's like to grow up without a father? To watch your mother work herself to the bone just to keep food on the table?" Officer Harrison stood there, his face a mask of anguish. He didn't try to defend himself or interrupt Monica's outburst. Instead, he seemed to shrink under the weight of her words, his shoulders slumping and his eyes filled with unshed tears. "I was just a little girl," Monica continued, her voice softer now but no less intense. "I needed my dad, and you took him away from me, from us. All those birthdays, school events, holidays, gone. And for what? A mistake?" Harrison swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Ms. Wilson, I can't begin to express how sorry I am. I've carried this guilt with me every day for years." Monica scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest. "Guilt? You think feeling guilty makes up for what we went through?" "No, it doesn't," Harrison admitted, shaking his head. "Nothing can make up for the pain I've caused your family. But I want you to know that I've been haunted by my mistake. I've questioned every decision, Every arrest I've made since then. I've tried to be a better officer, a better person." He took a shaky breath before continuing. "I've wanted to apologize for so long, but I was afraid. Afraid to face the consequences of my actions, afraid to confront the pain I'd caused. But seeing you here today, I knew I couldn't let this opportunity pass." Monica stared at him, her anger still simmering but now mixed with confusion. She hadn't expected this raw honesty, this open display of remorse. It didn't erase the years of pain, but it made her pause, made her see the man behind the badge for the first time. Monica stood there, her chest heaving with emotions she couldn't quite name. Officer Harrison's words hung in the air between them, heavy with regret and sorrow. She wanted to hold on to her anger, to let it shield her from the pain that threatened to overwhelm her. But as she looked at Harrison's face lined with guilt and remorse, she felt her resolve begin to crack. "You don't get to just say sorry and make it all better," Monica said, her voice trembling. "Do you know how many nights I cried myself to sleep? How many times I had to explain to my friends why my dad wasn't at school events?" Harrison nodded, his eyes never leaving Monica's face. "I can't imagine the pain you've been through. I know my words can't undo the damage I've caused. But I want you to know that I've spent every day since then trying to be better, to make sure nothing like this ever happens again." Monica shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "Why now? Why didn't you come forward sooner?" "I was a coward," Harrison admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was afraid of losing my job, of facing the consequences. But the guilt, it ate away at me. I've been trying to find a way to make amends, to somehow right this wrong." Monica listened, her emotions swirling like a storm inside her. Part of her wanted to forgive, to let go of the anger that had been her constant companion for so long. But another part, the wounded child who had grown up without a father, clung to that anger like a lifeline. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Monica said finally, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to." Harrison nodded, accepting her words with a sad resignation. "I understand. I don't expect forgiveness, Ms. Wilson. I needed you to know how sorry I am. How much I regret what happened to your family because of my mistake." Monica turned away, unable to bear the weight of his gaze any longer. She felt drained, exhausted by the sudden onslaught of emotions. The anger was still there, but now it was mixed with confusion, sadness, and a tiny spark of something she wasn't ready to name. Monica climbed back into her car, her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. She couldn't bring herself to look at Officer Harrison as she pulled away from the checkpoint. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, each memory that surfaced only fueling her anger and resentment. As she drove down the quiet country road, images from her past flooded her thoughts. She remembered the day the police had come to their house, how her mother had collapsed in tears when they took her father away. Monica had been just a little girl then, confused and scared, not understanding why her daddy was being put in handcuffs. The years that followed were a blur of struggle and hardship. She recalled her mother working multiple jobs, coming home late at night with dark circles under her eyes. Monica had learned to cook and clean at an age when most kids were still playing with dolls. She'd had to grow up fast, shouldering responsibilities that no child should have to bear. Tears blurred her vision as she remembered the first time she'd visited her father in prison. The cold, sterile visiting room, the guards watching their every move, the way her father's eyes had filled with tears when he saw how much she'd grown. It had been like seeing a stranger, not the loving dad who used to swing her around and call her his little princess. School had been its own kind of torture. The whispers, the sidelong glances, the way some parents wouldn't let their kids play with her anymore. "You don't want to hang around with a criminal's daughter," she'd overheard one mother say. The words had cut deep, leaving scars that never fully healed. As she drove, Monica's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Officer Harrison's apology echoed in her mind, but it felt hollow in the face of all they had lost. How could a simple, "I'm sorry," make up for the birthdays her father had missed, the graduations he couldn't attend, the countless moments that should have been filled with family but were instead marked by his absence? The injustice of it all burned in her chest. One man's mistake had cost them everything. And now, years later, he thought he could just apologize and make it all better? Monica shook her head, anger and hurt warring within her. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. Monica's car rolled to a stop in front of a small, weathered house. The peeling paint and overgrown lawn spoke of years of neglect. This was her father's new home, a far cry from the tidy suburban house of her childhood memories. She sat in the car for a long moment, her hands still gripping the steering wheel. The encounter with Officer Harrison had left her raw and vulnerable. All the anger and pain she'd pushed down for years was bubbling to the surface, making her question whether she was ready to face her father. Taking a deep breath, Monica finally stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched under her feet as she made her way to the front door. Each step felt heavier than the last, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached the doorstep, Monica froze. The faded welcome mat beneath her feet seemed to mock her. Welcome? After all these years, after everything they'd been through, how could anything about this feel welcoming? She raised her hand to knock, but it hovered there, trembling. The emotions from her encounter with Officer Harrison were still swirling inside her. Anger at the injustice, pain from the memories, and a confusing mix of resentment and longing for the father she'd lost. Monica stared at the chipped paint on the door, her mind racing. What would she say to him? How could she look into his eyes without seeing all the birthdays, graduations, and everyday moments he'd missed? The weight of their shared history pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. She lowered her hand, then raised it again, caught in an endless loop of indecision. The desire to see her father warred with the fear of reopening old wounds. She wasn't the little girl he'd left behind anymore. She'd grown up hardened by life's challenges. Would he even recognize the woman she'd become? Monica stood there, her hand suspended in midair, torn between knocking and turning away. The moment stretched on, filled with all the unspoken words and pent-up emotions of the past years. The door creaked open, revealing her father, David Wilson. His eyes widened as he saw Monica standing there, her face a mix of emotions. For a moment, they both froze, the weight of their shared history hanging heavy between them. "Monica, my daughter," David said softly, his voice cracking with emotion. "You're here." Monica nodded, unable to find her voice. She took in the sight of her father, older, grayer, but still unmistakably the man she remembered from her childhood. "Please come in," David said, stepping back to make room. Monica hesitated for a second before crossing the threshold. The living room was sparsely furnished, with a worn couch and a small TV in the corner. The walls were bare, save for a single framed photo of Monica as a child. "Can I get you something to drink?" David asked, his hands fidgeting nervously. "No, thanks," Monica replied, her voice barely above a whisper. They stood there, an awkward silence stretching between them. David cleared his throat, searching for words. "It's good to see you," he said finally. "You've grown into such a beautiful young woman." Monica nodded stiffly, unsure how to respond. The compliment, though sincere, felt hollow against the years of absence. "How was your drive?" David asked, grasping for small talk. "Fine," Monica said, then paused. "I ran into Officer Harrison at a checkpoint." David's face fell, a shadow of pain crossing his features. "Oh, Monica, I'm so sorry. That must have been difficult." Monica felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back, determined not to break down. "Yeah, it was," she said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. David took a step toward her, his hand reaching out, but he stopped short of touching her. The gap between them seemed insurmountable, filled with years of missed moments and unspoken words. "I'm glad you came," David said softly. "I've missed you so much." Monica nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She wanted to run to him, to hug him like she did when she was a little girl. But the pain of their separation held her back, an invisible barrier between them. They stood there, father and daughter, separated by more than just the physical space between them. The air was thick with unresolved pain and longing, neither knowing how to bridge the gap that had grown over the years. Monica and David moved to the worn couch, sitting at opposite ends. The distance between them felt like a chasm, filled with years of unspoken words and missed moments. Monica's hands fidgeted in her lap as she struggled to find the right words. "Dad," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something." David leaned forward, his eyes filled with concern. "What is it, sweetheart?" Monica took a deep breath. "On my way here, I was pulled over at a checkpoint. It was Officer Harrison." David's face fell, his shoulders sagging as if a great weight had suddenly been placed upon them. He closed his eyes for a moment, his expression a mix of pain and resignation. "Oh, Monica," he said softly, "I'm so sorry you had to go through that." Monica watched as her father's demeanor changed. The nervous energy that had filled him earlier seemed to drain away, replaced by a quiet, reflective sadness. David leaned back, his gaze distant. "You know," he said after a long pause, "I've been struggling with all of this too, coming to terms with what happened. It hasn't been easy." Monica felt a lump forming in her throat. "How do you do it?" she asked. "How do you not hate them for what they did to you, to us?" David sighed deeply. "It's not simple, Monica. Some days the anger feels like it might swallow me whole, but I've learned that holding on to that hate, it only hurts me more." He turned to look at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I've had to find a way to let go, not for their sake, but for my own peace." Monica felt her own eyes welling up. The sight of her father, vulnerable and open, stirred something deep within her. The anger that had fueled her for so long began to flicker, giving way to a confusing mix of emotions. "I don't know if I can do that," she admitted, her voice cracking. David nodded slowly. "I understand, sweetheart, it takes time, and I'm sorry I wasn't there to help you through it all these years." The room fell silent, both father and daughter lost in their own thoughts. The weight of their shared pain hung heavy in the air, but beneath it, a tiny spark of understanding had begun to grow. David leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant as he began to speak. "Being in prison, Monica, it's like being trapped in a nightmare you can't wake up from." Monica watched her father's face, noticing the deep lines etched by years of worry and pain. She felt a twinge in her heart, realizing for the first time how much he had aged. "Every day was the same," David continued, his voice low and heavy. "The same walls, the same faces, the same routines, but the worst part was the helplessness, knowing I was innocent but unable to do anything about it." He paused, swallowing hard. Monica could see the struggle in his eyes as he relived those dark memories. The anger, it was like a fire burning inside me. For years, it was all I had. I was angry at the system, at Officer Harrison, at the world. Sometimes, I even felt angry at you and your mother, for moving on without me. Monica felt tears welling up in her eyes. She wanted to reach out to him, but something held her back. David looked around the small living room, his gaze lingering on the unfamiliar furniture and decor. "Now that I'm out, everything feels strange. This is supposed to be my home, but I feel like a visitor in someone else's life." He turned back to Monica, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and uncertainty. "I'm trying to adjust, to find my place again, but it's hard. The world moved on without me, and I'm struggling to catch up." Monica listened, her heart breaking for her father. She had been so consumed by her own pain and anger that she hadn't fully considered what he had been through. The man before her seemed both familiar and a stranger at the same time. As David fell silent, Monica felt a deep sadness wash over her. She realized that while she had lost a father, he had lost everything: his freedom, his family, and years of his life that he could never get back. Monica looked at her father, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She took a deep breath and made a decision. "Dad," she said softly, "I think I'll stay here for a few days, if that's okay with you." David's eyes widened in surprise, a glimmer of hope flickering across his face. "Really? You'd do that?" Monica nodded, managing a small smile. "Yeah, I would. I think..." I think we both need it. Over the next few days, Monica and David slowly began to rebuild their relationship. They spent time cooking meals together, watching old movies they both loved, and taking short walks around the neighborhood. At first, their conversations were stilted and awkward, but as time passed, they found themselves opening up more. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, David turned to Monica. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry for not being there for you all these years." Monica felt tears prick her eyes. "Dad, it wasn't your fault. You were wrongly convicted." "I know, but I still feel like I let you down," David admitted. "I missed so much of your life." As they talked, Monica found herself sharing her own struggles. The loneliness, the anger, the feeling of abandonment. David listened intently, his eyes filled with understanding and regret. Through these conversations, Monica began to see her father in a new light. She realized that while she had been carrying her own pain, her father had been carrying an even heavier burden. The anger she had held onto for so long, especially toward Officer Harrison, began to feel less intense. One morning, as they shared breakfast, Monica found herself thinking about Officer Harrison. She remembered the guilt in his eyes, the tremor in his voice as he apologized. For the first time, she considered that he, too, might have been suffering all these years. "Dad," she said hesitantly, "do you ever think about Officer Harrison?" David paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly. "I used to think about him a lot," he admitted. "I was so angry at first. But over time, I realized that anger was only hurting me more." Monica listened, surprised by her father's words. She had expected him to share her resentment, but instead, she found wisdom and forgiveness. "It's not easy," David continued, "but I'm trying to let go of that anger. It doesn't change what happened, but it helps me move forward." His words resonated with Monica, making her reconsider her own feelings toward Officer Harrison. Monica and David stood at the entrance of Riverside Park, a place that held so many memories for both of them. Monica hesitated, her hand on the gate. "You okay, sweetheart?" David asked gently. Monica nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yeah, it's just been a while." They walked into the park together, the familiar sights and sounds washing over them. The old playground where Monica used to spend hours swinging and sliding was still there, though it looked smaller now. "Remember how you used to beg me to push you higher on the swings?" David chuckled, his eyes twinkling with the memory. Monica smiled, a lump forming in her throat. "Yeah, I do. You'd always say, 'Any higher and you'll touch the sky.'" As they strolled through the park, more memories surfaced. They passed the pond where David had taught Monica to skip stones, and the big oak tree where they used to have picnics on sunny days. "It's all still here," Monica said softly, her voice filled with wonder. David nodded, his expression a mix of joy and sadness. "It is, but we've changed, haven't we?" Monica looked at her father, really looked at him. She saw the lines on his face, etched by years of hardship, but she also saw strength in his eyes. He had endured so much, yet here he was, still standing, still trying to reconnect with her. Their next stop was Milo's Diner, where they used to have Sunday breakfasts. As they settled into a booth, the familiar smell of pancakes and coffee surrounded them. "Your mom and I had our first date here," David said, his eyes scanning the unchanged interior. Monica raised her eyebrows. "Really? I never knew that." As they talked over plates of pancakes, Monica began to see her father in a new light. He wasn't just the man who had been wrongfully imprisoned, not just a victim of a broken system. He was a survivor who had faced unimaginable challenges and come out the other side with his spirit intact. As they sat on a park bench overlooking the pond, David cleared his throat. "Monica, there's something I've been wanting to talk to you about." Monica turned to face her father, noticing the serious look in his eyes. "What is it, Dad?" David took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness lately." Monica tensed, unsure where this conversation was heading. "Forgiveness?" "Yes," David nodded slowly. Specifically, I've been considering forgiving Officer Harrison. Monica's eyes widened in shock. What? Dad, how can you even think about forgiving him after everything he put us through? David held up his hand gently. I know it sounds crazy, sweetheart, but hear me out. I'm not thinking about forgiving him for his sake. It's for my own peace of mind. Monica shook her head, her voice rising. Peace of mind? Dad, he ruined our lives. He took you away from us for years. I know, Monica. Believe me, I know, David said softly. But carrying all this anger and resentment, it's like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It's only hurting me. Monica stood up, pacing in front of the bench. I can't believe this. How can you just let it go like that? David watched his daughter, his heart aching for her pain. I'm not saying it's easy, Monica. It's one of the hardest things I've ever had to consider. But holding on to this anger, it's keeping me trapped in that cell even though I'm free now. Monica stopped pacing, her fists clenched at her sides. But Dad, he doesn't deserve forgiveness. He doesn't deserve anything from us. Maybe not, David agreed, but maybe I deserve to be free from this burden. Maybe we both do. Monica sat back down, her anger giving way to confusion and hurt. I don't know if I can do that, Dad. I'm still so angry. David reached out and took his daughter's hand. I know, sweetheart, and that's okay. We all heal in our own time. I'm just sharing where I'm at right now. Monica stared at her father, her emotions swirling like a storm inside her. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The idea of forgiving Officer Harrison seemed impossible, even wrong. But Dad, she protested, her voice cracking, he doesn't deserve forgiveness, not after what he did to us. David nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. I know it feels that way, Monica, but this isn't about what he deserves. It's about what we need to heal. Monica shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. How can forgiving him help us heal? He took you away from me for years. David reached out and gently took Monica's hand. Sweetheart, holding on to this anger, it's like carrying a heavy weight everywhere we go. It's exhausting, and it's keeping us stuck in the past. Monica looked down at their joined hands, her father's words sinking in. But I've been angry for so long, she whispered. I don't know how to let it go. I know, David said softly. It's not easy. But I've learned that holding on to anger only prolongs our suffering. It doesn't change what happened, and it doesn't punish the person who wronged us. It only hurts us more. Monica looked up at her father, seeing the peace in his eyes despite everything he'd been through. How did you get to this point, Dad? How can you even think about forgiving him? David smiled gently. It's been a long journey, Monica, but I realize that forgiving isn't about excusing what happened. It's about freeing ourselves from the pain of the past. He squeezed her hand. I want you to consider the power of forgiveness in your own life, Monica. Not just for Officer Harrison, but for yourself, too. You've been carrying this burden for so long. Maybe it's time to set it down. Monica felt tears rolling down her cheeks. I don't know if I can, Dad. I'm scared to let go of the anger. It's been a part of me for so long. David pulled her into a hug, holding her close. I know, sweetheart. It's okay to be scared. We'll take it one day at a time, together. Just think about it, okay? Monica nodded against her father's shoulder, feeling a mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. As they sat there on the park bench, the idea of forgiveness no longer seemed impossible, just terribly, achingly difficult. Monica sat on the park bench long after her father had gone inside to rest. The afternoon sun warmed her face, but inside, she felt cold and conflicted. Her father's words about forgiveness echoed in her mind, stirring up a whirlwind of emotions. As she watched people stroll by, laughing and enjoying their day, Monica realized how long it had been since she'd felt truly happy. The anger she'd carried for years had become a constant companion, coloring every aspect of her life. She thought about her job at the local community center. Just last week, she'd snapped at a coworker over a minor mistake. The look of hurt on her colleague's face flashed in her memory, making Monica wince. Had her anger over the past made her quick to judge others? Her mind wandered to her last relationship, which had ended badly. She'd always blamed her ex for not understanding her pain, but now she wondered if her own inability to let go had pushed him away. How many connections had she lost because of the wall she'd built around herself? Monica closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her resentment pressing down on her. It was exhausting, she realized, to be angry all the time. To always be on guard, ready to fight against perceived injustices. Opening her eyes, she noticed a young girl chasing Bubbles, her laughter ringing out across the park. Monica couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed like that with pure, unbridled joy. Had her anger stolen those moments from her? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the grass, Monica felt a shift inside her. Maybe her father was right. Maybe holding on to this anger wasn't punishing Officer Harrison or the system that had wronged them. Maybe it was only punishing herself. The thought of forgiveness still scared her. It felt like letting go of a part of herself, a part that had defined her for so long. But as she watched the world around her, full of life and possibilities, Monica began to wonder what her life could be like without the heavy burden of resentment. Monica stood up from the bench, her legs stiff from sitting for so long. She needed to move, to clear her head. Without a real destination in mind, she began to walk through the town, her footsteps echoing on the quiet streets. As she turned a corner, she nearly bumped into an elderly woman struggling with her groceries. Without thinking, Monica reached out to steady her. "Oh, thank you, dear," the woman said, her wrinkled face breaking into a warm smile. "Would you mind helping me across the street?" Monica hesitated for a moment, then nodded. As they crossed together, the woman chatted about her grandchildren, her voice filled with love. Monica found herself smiling despite her inner turmoil. Further down the street, she passed a small cafe. A young man was holding the door open for customers, greeting each one with a cheerful, "Have a great day." His kindness, freely given to strangers, touched something in Monica's heart. As she continued her walk, she noticed more and more small acts of kindness around her. A child sharing his ice cream with a friend, a shopkeeper giving directions to a lost tourist, a teenager helping a mother lift her stroller onto the bus. These simple gestures of human kindness began to chip away at the hard shell Monica had built around her heart. She realized that the world wasn't just full of injustice and pain. There was goodness too, often in the smallest of actions. As she watched a group of friends laughing together in a park, Monica felt a sudden longing. How long had it been since she'd allowed herself to connect with others like that? Her anger had kept people at arm's length, protecting her but also isolating her. For the first time, Monica began to understand what her father had meant about forgiveness. It wasn't about saying what Officer Harrison did was okay. It wasn't about forgetting the pain they'd endured. It was about freeing herself from the chains of the past, allowing herself to see and experience the good in the world again. Monica returned to her father's house, her steps lighter than when she had left. The walk through town had given her a new perspective, one that filled her with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. As she entered the living room, she found David sitting in his favorite armchair, reading a book. "Dad," Monica said softly, causing David to look up. "I think I'm ready to talk about forgiveness." David's eyes widened slightly and he set his book aside. "That's wonderful, Monica. Come, sit down." Monica settled onto the couch across from her father. She took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I'm not saying it'll be easy, but I want to try. I want to forgive Officer Harrison." David nodded, his eyes shining with pride and understanding. "That's a big step, honey. I'm proud of you for even considering it." "The thing is," Monica continued, her voice wavering slightly, "I'm not sure how to go about it. It feels so overwhelming." David leaned forward, his face softening. "It's okay to feel that way. Forgiveness isn't something that happens overnight. It's a process." Monica nodded, twisting her hands in her lap. I know, but where do I even start? David was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he said, what if we reached out to Officer Harrison together? We could invite him here or meet him somewhere neutral. Sometimes facing the person you need to forgive can be a powerful first step. Monica felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach at the thought of seeing Officer Harrison again, but beneath that anxiety was a glimmer of hope. You'd do that with me? She asked. Of course, David replied without hesitation. We're in this together, Monica. You don't have to face this alone. Monica felt tears prick at her eyes. For so long she had carried her anger and pain by herself. The idea of having her father's support touched her deeply. Okay, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Let's do it. Let's reach out to Officer Harrison. David reached across and squeezed her hand. I'm so proud of you, Monica. This is a big step, but I believe it's going to lead us all towards healing. Monica squeezed back, feeling a mixture of apprehension and hope. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, she felt ready to face it. Monica's hand trembled as she dialed the number. David sat beside her, offering silent support. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Officer Harrison speaking. Monica took a deep breath. Officer Harrison, this is Monica Wilson. We'd like to meet with you. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Monica? Of course. Are you sure? Yes, Monica said, her voice steadier now. My father and I would like to talk with you. Maybe at the park near Main Street? I'll be there, Officer Harrison replied, his voice a mix of surprise and relief. As Monica hung up, she felt a whirlwind of emotions. Her stomach churned with nervousness, and a flicker of anger still burned in her chest. But there was something else too, a tiny spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, this meeting could be the first step towards healing. David placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. You did great, honey. How are you feeling? Monica sighed, leaning into her father's touch. Scared, angry, hopeful, I don't know, it's all mixed up inside me. That's okay, David reassured her. It's normal to feel conflicted. What matters is that you're taking this step. As the day of the meeting approached, Monica's emotions intensified. She found herself pacing her father's living room, her mind racing with all the things she wanted to say to Officer Harrison. What if I can't do it? She asked David the night before. What if I see him and all I feel is anger? David pulled her into a hug. Then that's what you feel. This isn't about forcing forgiveness, Monica. It's about opening the door to possibility. Whatever happens, I'll be right there with you. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the park as Monica and David approached the bench where Officer Harrison sat waiting. The officer stood as they neared, his hands fidgeting nervously at his sides. Thank you for coming, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Monica's heart raced as she took in the sight of the man who had changed their lives so drastically. She felt a surge of anger, but also a twinge of something else. Pity, perhaps. They all sat down, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Monica stared at her hands, folded tightly in her lap. Officer Harrison kept glancing between father and daughter, his face a mix of shame and anxiety. For what felt like an eternity, no one spoke. The only sounds were the distant laughter of children playing and the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. Finally, David broke the silence. His voice was calm and steady as he addressed Officer Harrison. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us, he said. I know this can't be easy for you either. Officer Harrison nodded, swallowing hard. I've wanted to apologize for so long, he began, his voice cracking slightly. But I never knew how to even begin. Monica looked up, her eyes meeting Harrison's for the first time. She saw the pain and regret etched deeply in his face, and something inside her softened just a little. David reached out and placed a gentle hand on Monica's arm. We're here now, he said, looking from his daughter to Officer Harrison. And that's what matters. This is a chance for all of us to start healing. Monica took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. She knew that whatever happened next would shape their lives moving forward. With her father's encouragement, she found the strength to speak. "I've been so angry for so long," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm here because I want to understand. I want to know why." Officer Harrison took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his guilt. "I want to apologize again," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "What I did was unforgivable, but I hope you'll let me explain." Monica nodded, her eyes fixed on the officer's face. She noticed the deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth, signs of years of stress and regret. "Back then, I was a young officer eager to prove myself," Harrison continued. "There was so much pressure to solve cases quickly. When the evidence seemed to point to your father, I rushed to judgment." David squeezed Monica's hand gently, encouraging her to listen. She felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her, but she remained silent, allowing Harrison to speak. "I convinced myself I was doing the right thing," Harrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I ignored that feeling, and it's haunted me every day since." As Harrison spoke, Monica found herself truly listening for the first time. She saw the pain in his eyes, the way his hands shook as he recounted that fateful day. "I've thought about your family every single day," Harrison continued, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I've imagined the birthdays, the holidays, all the moments stolen because of my mistake. I know I can never give that time back, but I want you to know how deeply sorry I am." Monica felt a lump forming in her throat. The anger that had fueled her for so long began to give way to something else, a glimmer of understanding. "I've spent years trying to make amends," Harrison said. "I've advocated for better training, for more thorough investigations. I've spoken to young officers about the importance of following their instincts and not rushing to judgment, but I know none of that changes what happened to your family." As Harrison's words washed over her, Monica felt something shift inside her. The man before her wasn't the faceless villain she had imagined for so long. He was human, flawed, and clearly carrying the weight of his actions. David cleared his throat, his eyes meeting Harrison's. The park around them seemed to grow quiet, as if nature itself was holding its breath. "Officer Harrison," David began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I want you to understand what your actions cost me." Monica tensed, expecting her father's anger to pour out. But David's words, though heavy with pain, carried no bitterness. "I lost years of my life," he continued. "Years I can never get back. I missed watching my daughter grow up. I missed holding my wife's hand as she battled cancer. I lost my freedom, my dignity, and nearly lost hope." Harrison's face crumpled with shame, but David wasn't finished. "In prison, I was angry. So angry I could barely breathe sometimes. That anger became another set of bars around me, long after I knew the truth about my innocence." Monica felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had never heard her father speak so openly about his experience before. David took a deep breath, his next words shocking both Monica and Harrison. "But Officer Harrison, I want you to know that I forgive you." The words hung in the air, almost unbelievable. Monica's mouth fell open in surprise, and Harrison looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Dad?" Monica whispered, confusion clear in her voice. David reached out, placing a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "I've learned something important, Monica. Holding onto anger, onto hate, it's made me a prisoner in a different way. It's kept me from truly living, from moving forward." He turned back to Harrison, who sat frozen, barely breathing. "Forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened," David explained gently. "It's about freeing myself. It's the only way I can truly be free and start living again." Monica sat in stunned silence, her father's words echoing in her mind. She looked at David, seeing him in a new light. The man before her wasn't broken by his years in prison, but strengthened by them. His ability to forgive seemed almost superhuman to her. Tears welled up in Monica's eyes as she watched her father extend a hand to Officer Harrison. The gesture was simple, yet profound. It spoke of a strength she hadn't known her father possessed. "Dad," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "How can you forgive so easily?" David turned to his daughter, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and peace. "It's not easy, Monica. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. But holding on to anger was killing me from the inside out." Monica nodded, understanding dawning on her face. She looked at Officer Harrison, who sat with his head bowed, overwhelmed by David's forgiveness. In that moment, something shifted inside Monica. The anger that had been her constant companion for so long began to loosen its grip. She saw Officer Harrison not as the faceless enemy she'd imagined for years, but as a flawed human being who had made a terrible mistake. Taking a deep breath, Monica spoke. "Officer Harrison," she began, her voice shaky but determined. "What you did caused us so much pain. But I see now that holding on to that pain isn't helping anyone, least of all me." She paused, gathering her courage. I forgive you too. It might take time for me to fully heal, but I want to try." Officer Harrison looked up, his eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you," he whispered. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm grateful for it." Monica felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She realized that her father's strength wasn't in his ability to endure hardship, but in his capacity to let go and move forward. His example had given her the courage to do the same. As they sat there in the park, the air seemed lighter somehow. Monica knew that forgiveness wasn't a magic solution. There was still a long road ahead. But for the first time in years, she felt hope blooming in her heart. As the three of them sat together in the park, a profound silence fell over them. The weight of forgiveness hung in the air, almost tangible in its intensity. Officer Harrison's shoulders shook with quiet sobs, overwhelmed by the grace he had been shown. I don't know what to say," he stammered, wiping his eyes with trembling hands. "Your forgiveness means more than I can express." David reached out and placed a comforting hand on Harrison's shoulder. "It's a new beginning for all of us," he said softly. Monica watched this exchange, feeling a mix of emotions swirling within her. The anger that had been her constant companion for so long was slowly ebbing away, replaced by a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. Officer Harrison took a deep breath, composing himself. He looked at David and Monica with determination in his eyes. "I promise you both," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "I will spend every day of the rest of my life working to make sure no one else suffers the way you did. Your story, your forgiveness, it will drive me to be better, to do better." Monica felt something shift inside her at his words. The weight she had carried for so long, the burden of anger and resentment, began to lift. It was as if a dam had broken, allowing years of pent-up emotion to flow out of her. Tears streamed down her face as she realized she was finally letting go. The release was both painful and liberating, like setting down a heavy load she had carried for far too long. "I feel lighter," Monica whispered, almost to herself. She looked at her father, then at Officer Harrison, a small smile forming on her lips. "I didn't realize how much energy it took to stay angry." David wrapped an arm around his daughter, pulling her close. "It takes a lot of strength to forgive, Monica. I'm so proud of you." As they sat there together, the sun peeking through the trees, Monica felt a sense of hope she hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead might still be long and challenging, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. Not with anger, but with understanding and the power of forgiveness. Monica, David, and Officer Harrison walked together to a nearby diner, their steps lighter than before. The small bell above the door jingled as they entered, drawing a few curious glances from the other patrons. They settled into a cozy booth by the window, the afternoon sun casting a warm glow over their table. As they perused the menus, the initial awkwardness began to melt away. Officer Harrison cleared his throat and tentatively asked, "So, David, what's the first thing you did when you got out?" David chuckled softly. Believe it or not, I went straight to the park and sat on a bench for hours, just watching people, feeling the breeze. It was overwhelming in the best way. Monica listened intently, realizing there was so much about her father's experience she didn't know. She felt a pang of regret for the time they'd lost, but it was quickly replaced by gratitude for this moment of connection. The waitress came to take their order, and as she left, Harrison shared a story from his early days as a rookie cop. I was so nervous on my first traffic stop, I forgot to ask for the driver's license. Just stood there stammering about speed limits. To everyone's surprise, including her own, Monica burst out laughing. The sound was bright and genuine, filling the diner with warmth. David joined in, his deep chuckle mixing with his daughter's laughter. As their food arrived, the conversation flowed more easily. They shared stories of their lives, finding common ground in unexpected places. Harrison talked about his children, and David shared some of the positive experiences he'd had in prison, like teaching fellow inmates to read. Monica found herself opening up too, telling them about her job and her dreams for the future. As she spoke, she realized how long it had been since she'd allowed herself to be truly vulnerable with anyone. The atmosphere around their table was now filled with a sense of peace and mutual respect. The laughter came more frequently, and the silences were comfortable rather than tense. It was as if the act of forgiveness had opened a door, allowing them to see each other as whole people, not just defined by their past roles in each other's lives. As the three of them finished their meals, Monica found herself lost in thought. She gazed out the diner window, watching people pass by on the sidewalk, each with their own stories and struggles. The weight that had been pressing on her chest for years seemed to have lifted, replaced by a lightness she hadn't felt in a long time. She turned back to look at her father and Officer Harrison, engaged in a friendly debate about the best fishing spots in the area. A small smile played on her lips as she marveled at the scene before her. Just hours ago, she couldn't have imagined sitting at the same table with these two men, let alone enjoying their company. Monica's eyes lingered on her father's face, noticing the lines of worry that had softened since their meeting in the park. She felt a rush of warmth as she realized how much closer she felt to him now. The years of distance and resentment seemed to melt away, replaced by a newfound understanding and connection. As Officer Harrison shared a funny anecdote causing David to laugh heartily, Monica felt a sense of peace wash over her. The anger that had been her constant companion for so long was fading, making room for something new. Hope, perhaps, or the possibility of a brighter future. She realized that by choosing forgiveness, she had not only freed her father and Officer Harrison from the burden of the past, but herself as well. The resentment that had colored her world for so long was lifting, allowing her to see things in a new light. Monica felt a renewed sense of purpose stirring within her. She began to imagine the possibilities that lay ahead, no longer constrained by the chains of her anger. She could focus on rebuilding her relationship with her father, pursuing her dreams, and maybe even making a difference in her community. As the conversation around her continued, Monica silently thanked whatever force had brought them to this moment. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years she felt ready to face it, with an open heart and a lighter spirit. As the evening drew to a close, Monica, David, and Officer Harrison stood up from their table at the diner. The atmosphere was warm and relaxed, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled their earlier encounters. They made their way outside, where the setting sun painted the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. Officer Harrison turned to face Monica and David, his eyes filled with gratitude and a newfound sense of purpose. "I can't thank you both enough for giving me this chance," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want you to know that I meant every word I said. I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure what happened to you, David, never happens to anyone else." David nodded, a gentle smile on his face. "That's all we can ask for, John. Use your experience to make a difference." Monica watched the exchange, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. The anger that had fueled her for so long had dissipated, replaced by a quiet understanding. She realized that this moment marked the end of a painful chapter in her life and the beginning of something new. Officer Harrison? Monica said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. Thank you for meeting with us today. I know it wasn't easy, but it means a lot that you were willing to face us and take responsibility. Harrison nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. It's the least I could do. And please, call me John. I hope that someday we might even be friends. As they said their final goodbyes, Monica felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She watched Officer Harrison walk away, his steps seeming lighter than before. She knew that their paths would likely cross again in this small town, but now, instead of dread, she felt a glimmer of hope. Turning to her father, Monica saw her own emotions reflected in his eyes. They had both taken a huge step forward today, not just in forgiving Officer Harrison, but in healing their own relationship. As they walked back to David's house, Monica felt a sense of closure wash over her. The chapter of her life defined by anger and resentment was ending, making way for a new beginning filled with possibility and renewed connections. Monica and David walked back to his house in companionable silence. The weight of years of pain and misunderstanding finally lifted from their shoulders. As they entered the modest home, a sense of peace settled over them both. They made their way to the living room, where David gestured for Monica to sit on the worn but comfortable couch. He took a seat in his favorite armchair, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other, marveling at how much had changed in just one day. I never thought I'd feel this way again, David said softly, breaking the silence. It's like I can breathe easier now. Monica nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Me too, Dad. I've been carrying around so much anger for so long. I didn't realize how heavy it was until I let it go. David leaned forward, his eyes filled with hope.